Welcome to Go Library. This is Dr. Ming. Today, our guest is Benedict Rogers. Ben is the East Asia team leader at Christian Solidarity Worldwide. He's also the co-founder and deputy chairman of the Conservative Party Human Rights Committee. In September 2017, Ben was denied entry into Hong Kong. The next day, he announced to establish Hong Kong Watch. A critic of human rights of Hong Kong and China, Ben has been a constant target of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP's aggressive hostilities. A well-known example was the assault launched by a CCTV reporter at a Tory party conference in November 2018. Hello. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. In our first of the series of talks, I would like to ask you about Hong Kong. So last Sunday, the 10th May, was a dark day for Hong Kong. You published an article on Hong Kong Apple Daily. Please tell us about it.
Yes, on Sunday, it was one of the worst days, I think, that we have seen in Hong Kong in the last year. And of course, there have been many dark days in the last year of police brutality, of the erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms, of new legislation that is repressive, of people being arrested. But what we saw on Sunday was a new level of indiscriminate and totally disproportionate brutality by the police. It was Mother's Day, and there were mothers and families out shopping or dining in restaurants, and the police seemed to just fire pepper balls indiscriminately. They stopped and searched people indiscriminately. I was following it very closely through social media throughout the day, and I was particularly shocked when I saw, for example, I think 10-year-old child being dragged to the ground by a police officer, a 13-year-old boy called Look, who was like a kind of cub reporter. He was a 13-year-old kid who was trying to get out and have experience as a reporter, and he was arrested. And he's the kind of child that should be praised and encouraged and supported in his pursuing his dreams to be a reporter, but instead he was arrested and traumatized. I saw a woman holding a baby and police pointing their weapons at her. And of course there was the elected legislator who tried to mediate between the police and peaceful protesters, and he was dragged to the ground, and the police knelt on his head, and he ended up being in hospital. And this came 2 days after scenes of chaos and violence in the Legislative Council, where pro-Beijing legislators effectively tried to take over control of proceedings and physically assaulted a number of pro-democracy legislators. So what happened on Sunday, on Mother's Day, following what happened on Friday in the Legislative Council, amounts to very visual signs of the dramatic erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms and threats to Hong Kong itself.
Yeah, indeed. So you fast on once a week for the well-being of Hong Kong people. So tell us, what makes Hong Kong so special to you?
Well, Hong Kong is very special to me for a number of reasons. Firstly, on a personal level, I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover of Hong Kong from 1997 to 2002. Those were the first 5 years of my working career. I had graduated from university. I did a master's in China Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And then I went out to Hong Kong for my first job after university, and I worked for 5 years there as a journalist. So it was my home for 5 years. It was where I began my working life, my adult life, and for that reason, it's very special to me. Secondly, I feel as a British citizen that Britain has a particular responsibility to Hong Kong, partly because of our history and our history together. We have a moral responsibility to Hong Kong, but also we have a legal responsibility as a signatory with China to the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is a legal treaty lodged at the United Nations, and we have a responsibility under that treaty to make sure that the promises made to the people of Hong Kong for democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and a high degree of autonomy under one country, two systems are kept. And I feel as a British citizen that it's my duty to urge my government to live up to its promises under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And then thirdly, as somebody who is a human rights activist who believes very passionately in freedom and human rights for everyone around the world, I see Hong Kong as the new front line in the fight for freedom against tyranny, because if Hong Kong, which has been until now one of the most open and one of the freest cities in Asia, okay, it's not been a full democracy, but nevertheless, among the cities in Asia, it's one of the cities that has the highest degree of freedom and openness. If Hong Kong loses that, which it has already lost a lot of it, and if it loses it altogether, then actually our own freedoms are threatened next. And it is a threat that CCP's trampling on its promises to the people of Hong Kong actually is not just a threat to the people of Hong Kong, it's a threat to the international rules-based order. So Hong Kong is the people who are fighting for freedom in Hong Kong, I think, are fighting for freedom not just for themselves and for that city, but actually for the rest of us, for the free world.
Mm. So why did you decide to establish Hong Kong Watch?
I decided to establish Hong Kong Watch really for two reasons. The first is that in the previous year or two, I had been asked to host on a regular basis a number of visitors, prominent visitors from Hong Kong. Nathan Law, who was the youngest elected member of the Legislative Council, he was then disqualified because he quoted Mahatma Gandhi after taking his oath, and then ended up in prison because of his role in peaceful protests in the Umbrella Movement in 2014. He came to London in, I think, 2016, and I helped to host him in London. Then Joshua Wong came to London, and I also helped to arrange meetings for him. And then Anson Chan, the former Chief Secretary of Hong Kong, former top civil servant who's now a very prominent and courageous voice for democracy in Hong Kong, came. And again, I ended up arranging meetings for her. And after those three visits, I realized that it wasn't sustainable to be relying on me, one individual, in my spare time, arranging meetings. And I travel quite a lot internationally, of course not during the lockdown under the coronavirus, but in normal times I travel a lot. And so it was really good fortune that I happened to be in London when those three distinguished visitors came, but I could easily have not been here. And so I thought, actually, it's not sustainable to be relying on me in my spare time. We need to have an organization that can provide a platform for advocacy for Hong Kong. But the second thing that I also realized was that at that time, it's changed now, but at that time, the level of awareness among members of parliament, among the media, among the general public about the slow but steady erosion of freedoms in Hong Kong was shockingly low. People were not aware, people were not informed about what was happening in Hong Kong. And I thought we need to have an organization that can inform people, that can provide research and briefings and advocate to ensure that our members of parliament and our government and our media cover Hong Kong better and speak out for Hong Kong more. And those are the reasons I set up Hong Kong Watch together with others, because I realized that Hong Kong, the situation in Hong Kong had reached such a point, even back then in 2017, and it was nowhere near as serious as it is now. But even in 2017, I realized Hong Kong needed a voice.
Mm-hmm. And also, you were denied entry into Hong Kong.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So, in October 2017, I decided to try to visit Hong Kong again. I had been back to Hong Kong a number of times after I left in 2002. I went back between 2002 and 2017 several times. But in 2017, I thought, if I'm going to start Hong Kong Watch, and we had the idea for Hong Kong Watch before my attempted visit in October 2017. We began to plan it probably in about August, September 2017. But I thought, if we're going to start this organization, I should go back to Hong Kong and update myself firsthand on the ground on the situation in Hong Kong, not by doing anything public or anything radical, but simply by meeting old friends and new friends to chat privately about what are the issues in Hong Kong. So I was intending to have tea or coffee or dim sum with different people in Hong Kong over the course of a few days, totally privately. I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't going to protest. I wasn't going to have some big rally, or I was just going to meet people privately. And unfortunately, the Chinese authorities became aware that I was planning to go, and when I landed in Hong Kong airport, I was taken aside. I was told that I was not permitted to enter Hong Kong, and I was put back on a plane. And that incident did actually draw quite a lot of attention. I would never have sought that attention for myself, but I welcomed the fact that it did draw publicity, which we were able to then use as a spotlight on the situation in Hong Kong. So the British Foreign Secretary at the time, who's now the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, issued a very strong statement. The Foreign Office summoned the Chinese ambassador. My case was raised in both houses of Parliament a number of times. And I always said to members of Parliament who wanted to raise my case, I said, please go ahead and raise it, but don't make it about me, make it about Hong Kong, because what has happened to me in itself is tiny compared to what's happened to the people of Hong Kong. But if my case can be used to highlight because it was a breach of Hong Kong's autonomy, of the Joint Declaration, the Basic Law, for Beijing to intervene in Hong Kong's immigration policy. If that can be used to highlight the wider issues in Hong Kong, then go ahead and raise it. And so it was raised, and it drew a lot more publicity than I expected. And yeah, that's what happened.
Yeah. What is the most worrying change you have observed in Hong Kong since you founded Hong Kong Watch in December 2017?
I think there have been many worrying changes, but I think probably the police brutality is the most shocking to me, because when I lived in Hong Kong, the police at that time, at least from my observation, were generally a professional, respectable police force, a little bit similar to the British police force. Not perfect, no police force is perfect, but generally professional and generally observing the rule of law and proper standards of policing. And what we've seen over the last year is repeated, outrageous, indiscriminate, completely disproportionate, totally unnecessary and totally unjustified brutality on the part of the police, including things like arresting journalists, arresting doctors, nurses and first aiders, threatening passers-by, verbally abusing totally innocent bystanders, sexually harassing women, arresting and beating young children, and the list goes on. The list of atrocities, I think, is well known. And although I accept that at some moments in the last year, some of the protesters have carried out acts of violence themselves, and I don't condone those acts of violence by protesters, I think it's important to remember that their acts of violence were in response to police brutality. If you remember, when the protests first began in June last year, they were entirely peaceful, and we saw, at one point 1 million people, on one day 2 million people marching peacefully, and it was the police that responded to peaceful protests with violence and brutality. And so the combination of the police violence and a government that refused to listen to the protesters led a small minority of protesters to turn to more extreme violent action. So I accept that those acts happened, but nevertheless, still the police response to the vast majority of protesters and peaceful protesters has been really shocking. I think that's the thing that's most worried me. But I think also the some of the events in recent weeks of, for example, the arrest of some of the most prominent moderate pro-democracy politicians, people like Martin Lee, known as the father of the democracy movement, and Jimmy Lai, the owner of the Apple Daily. These are people who are not, radical, violent protesters. They are very distinguished, internationally respected, very moderate, very peaceful, pro-democracy politicians, really from the establishment. And so to go after them is an extremely worrying sign. I also think the language coming out of Beijing in the last few weeks of saying that, for example, Article 22, which is the article in the Basic Law that says that government departments in the mainland do not have a right to interfere in those issues that are the autonomous responsibility of the Hong Kong government. And Beijing has now said Article 22 does not apply any longer, in effect. They've also called for the implementation of Article 23, which is the national security law, which would have a devastating effect on freedom of expression. So I think those three things are what alarm me most. The police brutality that is conducted with impunity, and the government's refusal to hold an independent inquiry into police brutality, or even to condemn or hold to account police officers who've acted out of line, combined with very alarming developments in legislation and in the language coming out, the interpretation coming out from Beijing.
Okay. And were you surprised when the Hong Kong protest first began last June?
I wasn't surprised that they begun, because if you remember, the spark for the protest was Carrie Lam's proposed extradition bill. And it was clear from the moment she proposed it that this bill was an enormous assault on the firewall that has separated Hong Kong from the mainland under the principle of one country, two systems, and protected Hong Kong as a city that's prided itself on the rule of law from the mainland legal system, which is certainly not rule of law. It's a system of rule by law, where there is no independent judiciary, no such thing as a fair trial, where there's widespread torture, arbitrary arrest, disappearance, execution, and politicized trials. And when she proposed this extradition bill, it was clear from the immediate indications from the legal sector, the business sector, the general public, and the international community that Hong Kongers were outraged by such a proposal. So when the protest started, I think I was not so surprised, because I knew Hong Kongers would find ways to protest. I guess I was fairly surprised by the scale of the protests, and when it reached at 1.2 million people taking to the streets. That's a significant proportion of Hong Kong's population. And what was very interesting about the movement, certainly at that time, was that it drew together people who never normally joined forces otherwise. So particularly the business community. The business community is never usually on the same side as the pro-democracy movement. But on this issue, chambers of commerce, businesses, ordinary people who had no involvement previously in the pro-democracy movement, as well as activists, all joined together on this. And I think that was very striking about the movement last year.
And how do you comment on Hong Kong protests and protesters?
Overall, I think the Hong Kong protesters and the protest movement has shown inspiring and extraordinary courage, commitment, dedication, endurance. I'm amazed that after everything they've been through, the police brutality, the tear gas, pepper spray, beatings with batons, rubber bullets, and other weapons used against them, the shocking stories of what's happened to young people in detention, despite all that, they still go on. And we've seen, even though there was a break because of the coronavirus, we've seen in recent days some of the protests start again. And I think that says so much about both the courage, but also in a sense the desperation of Hong Kongers, that they know that their future is on the line, that if they don't fight what's happening and protest, Hong Kong will, Hong Kong could well disappear as we know it. And so I'm deeply impressed by them. Of course, as I said earlier, there have been a minority of protesters who've acted with violence, and I repeat, I don't condone that violence, but I do think we need to understand why it happened, and it happened in response to police brutality and in response to a government that so many times had a chance to change course and yet refused to listen. And one of the reasons protests are happening again now is that in November last year, Hong Kong people sent an overwhelmingly clear message in a peaceful way in the district council elections. They spoke through the ballot box and delivered their message very clearly that they want democracy. The pro-democracy parties overwhelmingly won the district council elections. And Carrie Lam and the Hong Kong government and Beijing could and should have taken that as an opportunity to stop and change course and to find ways to pursue reconciliation through a process of political reform. But they didn't. They even refused to listen to and rejected the voice of the people expressed at the ballot box. And so people now are protesting because they don't see any other way to express themselves. They don't see a way of making their voice heard through the normal channels that we have in this country and democracies have.
Today, the police commissioner, Chris Tam, says that the police is going to arrest a teenager girl who alleged to be gun raped in a police station. And I want to know your view about that. And also, I want to ask, do you believe the reports that Hong Kong police torture, rape, gun rape, sodomize, and slaughter detained protesters, as well as secretly transfer them to mainland China?
I think what Chris Tang has said is extremely dangerous and worrying. I think that, of course, we have to be careful in basing everything we do on evidence. And I don't have first-hand evidence of the reports that you've cited. And so I don't want to say that everything that is said is definitely true. I can't say that having not seen the evidence, but I certainly think that these allegations of rape and torture and other horrific things are certainly believable, because we've seen what the police has done on the streets in full view of the cameras. We see it on our social media and on our television screens. So that asks the question, how much worse are they behind closed doors in these detention centres where the cameras are not watching? So for that reason, I think it's certainly possible. And I think that they should be investigated. So the response of the police commissioner should have been to order an independent inquiry, not by the police, but by a truly independent body, to find out if these allegations are correct. And at the same time, the young teenage girl who's making these claims should have been given the protection and the support and the care that she needs, because undoubtedly she must be in extreme trauma. If at the end of the investigation, and I'm speaking hypothetically here, but if at the end of the investigation it's found that actually the allegations are not correct, are false, then okay, there may be steps to be taken on that. But to arrest or to threaten to arrest a young woman who claims to have been raped without any independent investigation into her claims, and to be making the victim into the criminal, is truly outrageous. It should be the alleged perpetrators of these crimes who should be being questioned and held to account. Her claims should be thoroughly investigated. She should be given sympathy and support and protection. And then we should see what the truth is at the end of that process. But to do what he's done now is really unacceptable.
Name 3 issues of most urgency on your agenda to help Hong Kong protesters.
I think that the first and most urgent is for the international community to speak out really strongly and clearly and unambiguously. I welcome the support and the comments that have been expressed in response to different incidents by some governments, particularly the United States and others. I feel my own government, the United Kingdom, whilst they have spoken out on occasions, I don't think they have been nearly strong or robust enough. And I think Britain should be taking much more of a lead internationally in speaking out against the escalating erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms, human rights, the rule of law, and autonomy. So Britain should take a lead. The international community as a whole should speak out. I think that Britain should actually form some kind of international contact group to bring together like-minded countries, so that, because one of the things I find in my advocacy is that Britain says we can't do this alone, but then other governments say, but this is Britain's responsibility primarily, so we're looking to Britain to lead. I think we should put those two things together and say Britain should lead, but other countries should support Britain, and they should form some kind of more coordinated grouping to coordinate efforts and to speak out. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think that there should be an international inquiry into police brutality. It's very clear now that the Hong Kong government is not going to allow an independent inquiry in Hong Kong. And if that's the case, then there should be an international inquiry with powers to impose justice and to hold those responsible for serious violations of human rights accountable. And then thirdly, I think there should be the introduction by many different governments of targeted Magnitsky sanctions, targeting the assets of individual Chinese and Hong Kong officials and police officers who are either directly responsible for human rights violations or who are complicit with and indirectly responsible because of their chain of command responsibilities. Those are 3 things. There are other things I could add. I think Britain should be doing more for British national overseas passport holders in Hong Kong, Hong Kongers who hold that special status but who don't have the right to of abode in the UK. We should be doing much more to protect them. We should be finding ways to, together with other countries, to offer sanctuary for some of the most vulnerable activists in Hong Kong who may need a place of safety. But you asked me 3 things. I added a few others, but those are my 3 things.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. Many Hong Kongers and their supporters feel disappointed about no enforcement of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, in spite of it passing the US legislature. So what can the UK do differently?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to understand about the UK as a difference from the United States is that whereas in the United States, Congress has the power to introduce legislation and, if you like, sort of impose that legislation on the administration. In the British system, because we're a parliamentary system, legislation that goes through Parliament really has to have the support of the government. So if the government doesn't want a particular piece of legislation, it's not going to have any chance of going through. But also, Parliament almost never, with the exception of our Magnitsky legislation, almost never legislates on foreign policy. So some people have asked whether Britain could have a Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act like the United States. In theory, it could, but unless the British government, the government itself, is going to support it, it doesn't have much chance in Parliament. So there are other things that I think Britain should be doing. We do have Magnitsky legislation already in place, and I know the government is committed to introducing secondary legislation in order to be able to implement Magnitsky sanctions. And I know that in general, the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab has said that Magnitsky sanctions are something that he feels very strongly about and really wants to pursue. He hasn't said that specifically in relation to Hong Kong, but in general terms. So if we have Magnitsky legislation, we should be urging the British government to use that legislation once the whole legislation is passed, which is still in process, to use that legislation to target Magnitsky sanctions on Chinese and Hong Kong officials responsible for human rights violations. That's the first thing. Secondly, I already spoke about BNO, British National Overseas Passport holders. And the third thing is, again, as I've already said, Britain needs to be much more vocal. I think there may be value in Britain looking at what legal remedies could be taken for breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The Sino-British Joint Declaration is an international treaty lodged at the United Nations, and so it would be worth looking into whether a case could be brought, for example, to the International Court of Justice or other international mechanisms for breach of an international treaty. But overall, those are some specific steps, but overall, I would say Britain needs to really step up and take a lead. In 1996, the Prime Minister at the time, John Major, a year before the handover, said in Hong Kong that if there is a breach of the Joint Declaration, Britain would have an obligation to pursue every avenue to address that breach. And he said these words to the people of Hong Kong: "You will never have to walk alone." And Britain now has a responsibility, long overdue, to live up to that promise and make sure that Hong Kongers don't have to walk alone or struggle alone.
So, what impact does the pandemic inflict on Hong Kong protests?
Well, it has had the effect in the last few months, of course, of creating a pause in the protests, because it was not safe for people to gather in large numbers. There have been some small protests even during that time, but the large numbers of protests that we saw last year paused. And in some ways, I think that's possibly a good thing, in that the people protesting must have been exhausted. They were out on the streets day after day. They were facing great danger from the police, and it may well be a good thing that they have had a few months to take a pause, to rethink, to regain their strength, to re-strategize. We've seen in the last few days protests beginning again. We've seen totally peaceful protests of ordinary Hong Kongers gathering in shopping malls and singing the anthem of the movement, "Glory to Hong Kong." but the effect of the pandemic was to give people that pause. I think now in the coming months we will see increased activity again, both in the form of protest, but of course also the focus will be on the forthcoming legislative council elections in September, and people will be, I presume, planning and strategizing for that.
Mm. And how does Hong Kong help the world to understand the nature of the CCP?
I think it helps the world in a very visual and vivid way, because much of what happens in mainland China remains hidden to the world, even though there is significant international presence in China in the form of business and tourists and even to some extent media, although of course foreign correspondents have been expelled from the country at an increasing rate. But much of what happens in mainland China under the CCP remains hidden. We have been able to gather information about the concentration camps in Xinjiang, where 1 million, maybe as many as 3 million people are held, but access is extremely limited. We've gathered that information through satellite imagery and through other research, whereas Hong Kong is still, even now, an open city, a city that where international media, social media, the internet has access. And so when we see the Hong Kong police force, which, as I said earlier, used to be a very respected police force, one of the most respected in Asia, when we see them behaving with such brutality, we really see the face of the CCP in their behavior. When we see Carrie Lam saying, for example, as she did, I think today, that she blames the school system for the protests and she wants to change the education system, that is instinctively the CCP's message. They're not looking at the possibility that these protests are happening because people genuinely want democracy, want their human rights, want a say in their future. They're thinking that they're brainwashed and influenced by Western democracy or Western values through the school system, and so the answer in their mind is to change the school system. That's the CCP speaking. When we see, for example, as has happened several times this year, a number of international statements organized expressing concern about what's happening in Hong Kong. For example, on New Year's Eve this year, there was a statement signed by about 45 international dignitaries from around 18 different countries, including former foreign ministers, former ambassadors, parliamentarians, religious leaders. Instead of listening to the concerns in this letter from some extremely distinguished people from all corners of the world, including many people in Asia, the reaction of the Hong Kong government was to issue a statement effectively saying that they were all misled, misinformed, and pretty much accusing them of being, idiots, really. I mean, that was the implication of the Hong Kong government statement. And that's a statement clearly that was directed by the CCP. Again, just the other week, there was a letter from, I think, 34 members of the European Parliament to Carrie Lam. And again, instead of listening to the opinion of elected members of the European Parliament, the statement from the Hong Kong government, again, pretty much said these European politicians are idiots. I mean, I think... I'm not sure if they actually used that word. They may have done, but if they didn't use that word, that was the clear message. And that is not how a sensible, educated, civilized government of a major international financial center should behave. But it is how the CCP behaves. And therefore, I think we can see the CCP and its character in the words of the Hong Kong government, the Hong Kong police force, and what's happening on the streets of Hong Kong.
Are you optimistic for Hong Kong protesters to achieve their goal of 5 demands, not one less?
In the long term, I always maintain optimism and hope. for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think the courage and the dedication and the determination of the protesters should not be underestimated, and gives me some hope. Secondly, the example of history shows that regimes, dictatorships do not last forever, and they often change or fall at times when we least expect them. So in my own work, I was involved in the struggle for freedom for the tiny country of East Timor, Timor-Leste, which had been occupied by Indonesia for many years. And people had said to me, it's a hopeless struggle. The East Timorese are fighting a losing battle. They will never win their freedom. You're wasting your time. But finally, East Timor in 1999, despite much bloodshed and at a very high cost, won their freedom. We've seen the fall of apartheid in South Africa, the fall of the Soviet Union, and freedom across Eastern Europe. So I think these things are not impossible, and change will come. And I'm also a little bit, perhaps cautiously optimistic now, that the effects of the pandemic has been that many more people around the world are waking up to the nature and the danger of the CCP, and people are increasingly talking about the need to change our policy towards the CCP. So I think that if more people continue to wake up, and if the world begins to realize that there's a grave danger in Hong Kong, then yes, there's still a chance to rescue the situation and to prevent Hong Kong going further down the path that it's on. But I'm optimistic for those reasons. If you look at it in purely realistic, worldly, immediate terms, I'm less optimistic unless the international community really act, because the CCP has been cracking down so intensely in the last few weeks, and has been doing so in various ways over the last few years. And if it's allowed to continue on the path that it's on, then I'm less hopeful that Hong Kong will not simply become absorbed into mainland China and become another mainland Chinese city, and one country, two systems will be dead. One country, two systems is very nearly dead, and we have to act robustly and fast to save it. So I'm optimistic because of my values and because of the example of history, the example of the protesters, but we need the world to act to turn that optimism into reality.
Do you have any other things to say about Hong Kong?
Yes, perhaps one thing I didn't stress enough is that I think Hong Kong is of critical importance to everybody. It's of critical importance to the international community, but it's also actually of real importance to China. And I think that it is in everyone's interests, including China's interests, to stop what's happening now and to uphold one country, two systems, because Hong Kong is such an important major financial center. But the reason it's a successful international center is because that is underpinned by the values of the rule of law, basic freedoms, transparency, openness, autonomy. And if those values are undermined and destroyed, as they are increasingly being so, then Hong Kong's status as an international financial center will disappear, and Hong Kong will disappear as that international financial center. And that is something that should matter to the international community, but it should also matter to China, because China uses Hong Kong as a financial center as well. Hong Kong Watch earlier this year published a report that's available on our website called Why Hong Kong Matters. And I hope that policymakers will look at that report and realize just how important Hong Kong is and how damaging it will be for everyone, not just Hong Kongers, if we lose Hong Kong as a financial center and as a front line for freedom. The only other thing I would say, which is something that I'm try to say whenever I can, and I think is very important, is that in this whole discussion about human rights in Hong Kong, and hopefully we'll have further discussions about human rights in China, I think it's really important, and also when we discuss the CCP's behavior beyond its borders around the rest of the world, and particularly in the context of the pandemic, it's really important that we distinguish between the CCP regime, the Chinese Communist Party regime, and China and the Chinese people. I am pro-China in the sense of being pro the country of China, the people of China, and I've spent a lot of time in mainland China. I have many Chinese friends, and I love China. It is the CCP that I am critical of, and that I think we should all be waking up to. And I think that's really important. I do not approve of, indeed I condemn, Sinophobia, anti-Chinese racism, comments that are made about Chinese people. That's not what I'm about at all. As I say, I love Chinese people, and I have many Chinese friends. And I think this should be a fight not about China and the West, but about the values of freedom and truth and democracy versus a regime that is based on lies and fear and terror and brutality.
That's a very strong message to the world. Oh, thank you so much, Ben. It's such a brilliant answer. So it's such a privilege to listen to your answer to the questions. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.